Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Global Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to share with you my wish list for 2019. It's probably a little bit too late for Sony to do anything about it, but a wish list is a wish list, so let's just hope that some of my wishes come true for 2019. Let's start with lenses. Lenses are always a popular item. We've got a good lens lineup now in Sony's range, 30 lenses including the teleconverters, but there are still one or two more gaps. And the first one is an ultra wide angle prime. This is a Voigtlander 15mm, which I've taken the lens hood off, and I like this because it's small. Okay, and I've got the 1635 GM, but if I'm traveling light and I want to take a small bag, a small ultra wide angle prime is certainly a possibility. Now there could be options for two of these. One could be a wide aperture for astrophotographers. This one isn't a wide aperture, which is why it's so small, but this one would be my preferred favorite. And look at the size of the filter kit, the NISI filter kit that can be used with a very small ultra wide angle prime. So we not only save weight and size on the lens, but we also save it on the filter system that we have to take to use with these for landscape photography. A very popular one, or wish that I've seen from many users, is a 135. Sony had an excellent 135. This is the A mount for the DSLT cameras. This one, however, is a £3 piece of glass. It's got that 1.8 aperture, and if I had to lay a bet on it, I suspect Sony have got this in development already, and I suspect it's a wide aperture lens. I would have preferred them to maybe go the 2.8 route, get the lens a lot lighter. I've tested the Batis 135 2.8. That is an excellent lens, and with only a 2.8 aperture, some people would say, why don't you just use the 70 to 200 GM? That also has a 2.8 aperture and is very sharp. But the 135 2.8 from Zeiss is half the weight. And again, it's all about that weight saving for when people are traveling. So I'm hoping it's a 2.8 because I do value perhaps portability. I think the bokeh or the shallow depth of field, the figure ground separation on a 2.8 at 135 is enough. I don't really need to go much wider than that. Okay, the next one is affordable primes. Okay, Sony, I think in 2017 gave us the 85mm 1.8. It's not a G, it's not a GM, it's not a Zeiss, so it was very affordable, but it was pin sharp, sharper than the Batis 85mm 1.8. And it also had the advantage that it has a focus hold button on the barrel of the lens, which I use for IAF. So hands down, this would be my firm favorite over the Batis. I just hope they roll this idea of giving affordable lenses out over some more focal lengths. And again, I wouldn't like them to go crazy with aperture, okay, because still the 35mm 2.8 Zeiss is still one of my favorite lenses because of its size and portability. I know a lot of people will prefer a 1.8 or the 1.4 that already exists, but those are big lenses, and so I would definitely again like portability. And they don't need to be GM lenses, just or even G lenses. They just need to be affordable and sharp. One of the things that I would like Sony to do, and this is probably not possible to retrograde, this is maybe create a 1.4 teleconverter that could be used on some of their primes. For instance, this actually won't fit the 85, but this would actually convert this, if it could, into a 135 2.8 or thereabouts. And so it would be great if, again, for portability, rather than taking extra lenses, we could take one teleconverter and basically make two lenses out of one. Now the 1.4 is, we lose one stop, but we don't give much away in sharpness, which is why I prefer it to the 2x teleconverter. So if they could consider that in future lens designs, as I said, I don't think they can make that one backwards compatible, but if they could consider it in future lens designs, that would be on my wish list. So one more lens here is we have the excellent 24-105, a very, very popular lens. It's lighter than the 2470 GM. It's got a little bit more reach. Yes, it's an f4, not a 2.8, but that has proved to be a very popular lens. It's also a G rather than a GM, so there's a saving on cost. Now, I would like to see Sony give a go for a lens they already have in their lens lineup, which is the 2470 f4. Now, this is a Zeiss design lens, and it's one of the few lenses in the lens lineup that the alpha community wasn't super impressed with. Hasn't been that popular. Most people, when they're curating a kit now, will lean towards the Tamron or the Sony 24-105 and give this 2470 a miss. So I'd like Sony to give this a go. I think Zeiss designed a little bit of a lemon for Sony. I know some people find it acceptable to use, but I think we need to raise the bar above acceptable. And again, Sony, please put that focus hold on. I don't know what Zeiss are doing by leaving those buttons off. Great place to have the IAF button. All of my lenses, apart from the Zeiss lenses, now have that focus hold. So again, room for improvement there. We have my A9 camera here with the 2470 f4. Now, occasionally I'll shoot with the Sony 6500 camera, and because I like shooting sports action, I actually use this 7200 on the A6500, but that is a little bit of overkill really. This is a full frame lens. I think for the APS-C users, I think it would be great if we created some constant 2.8 zooms. They released a lovely 18-135, which was pin sharp, but it wasn't a constant zoom. I think we could again save weight for the crop sensor users by maybe a 2470 equivalent and a 7200 equivalent lenses, but with a constant aperture, and maybe a couple more primes wouldn't go amiss, because I think there is going to be a little bit more focus. I know Fuji are pushing out with their X-T3 cameras on that APS-C format. I think Sony should give Fuji a run for their money now and show them that they still have the best focusing cameras in mirrorless lineups. We'll look at firmware now for my list. Okay, a popular request, I think Sony must be aware of this now, is the AF area. When it's in grey and we're moving that around the screen, when it moves over a very busy area of the scene, a lot of people will lose track. Let's just get it bright and maybe green, and so everybody can quite clearly see where that AF point is going. Okay, so I think that must be possible in a firmware upgrade, so let's hope that arrives in 2019. While we're on firmware, let's take a look at some things that I would love to happen. On this little RX100, we have an ND filter. Not that we put it in front of the lens, but it's actually a software feature or a firmware feature that we basically get an ND8 filter just by switching a button on the camera. Now, this would actually be great for sport shooters who are shooting in full sun. They need to close the aperture down to slow the shutter speed down, but you don't really want to be putting ND filters on the front of these telephoto lenses. It's just too time consuming, and the bigger the lenses, the more expensive those ND filters get. An ND8 would actually be enough so that we don't have to push the aperture down below f8 or f11 on the A9 and the A7 III, and thereby losing the ability to do focus tracking. So we are often, most cameras, when we're doing the PDAF focus tracking, like on the A7R III, we have to keep the aperture f8 and wider. But if we have that digital ND filter, then we can start slowing that shutter speed down for that movement blur in sports action photography. Maybe for landscape photographers, we could go further beyond ND8. Maybe if it was possible, even put out a digital ND64 filter, so we can get soft focus water without actually having to invest in filter systems in front of the lenses. Not too sure whether that strength of a digital filter is possible, but if it is, definitely on my wish list. Intervalometer. Now, Nikon build in intervalometers into their firmware. I really begrudge having to carry one of these around on the off chance that I'm going to do a time lapse. We can do time-lapse in slow and quick, or S and Q, but that's not in RAW, and so I would like the ability for the firmware to offer us this intervalometer feature. If Nikon can do it, then come on, Sony, let's have one in the firmware for the Sony cameras. One of the things in the firmware for Canon users is small RAW. When we're shooting with the R cameras 42.4 megapixels, and let's say we're doing time-lapse, that's a serious amount of overkill, because even if we go out at 4K time-lapse, that's only 8.5 megapixels. So we're basically shooting way too many high-resolution images for what we actually need. So again, small RAW would be a great feature to have when we don't actually need the full 42.4 megapixels. It would even be useful on the 24 megapixel sensor cameras as well. I think the menu systems could Sony could do one more push on the menu systems. There are some things that seem to be separated. Often when I'm showing people how to set up focus, I don't really understand why the focus assist is separated from the AF menus, and obviously if we're going into DMF and then we want to activate focus assist, we've got to move forward 3 or 4 pages to find that options. And when having the touch panel focus, that's in a completely different menu system altogether. It'd be great if we just group them together, even if we just had to double up so that they appear in 2 different menus. I think that would be great for users to find the menu items they're looking for more easily. Again, with firmware, there could be a couple of things that they could do, like I constantly have to tell people where bulb has disappeared, because it's not grayed out, it's just not there when we're shooting in continuous drive mode. So if it could just be grayed out, and so then people can press and say, okay, switch to single shot mode, and then I will allow you to use bulb. That would again assist people with setting up their cameras. Firmware upgrades, I think we got the A9 here. There are a couple of features that then appeared on the later models like the A7 III and the A7R III that really haven't come back to the A9, and they should have done really. And a couple of those are things like auto switch media. I can't have the A9 when the slot 1, which is the fast card slot, suddenly just automatically roll onto slot 2. I basically have to stop shooting and then tell the camera to use slot 2, or switch the cards around if I still need the speed. That shouldn't really be something that we're still doing. We can't rate on the custom buttons. Okay, we can protect, but we can't rate. There's a couple of things that we can't assign to custom buttons, like touch operation. Those all should come back into that firmware. So that would be good if Sony could do that. And again, while we're talking about firmware, what I'd like to see is on the top of the memory dial, we've got the shoot mode dial, we've got 1, 2, and on some cameras 3. Let's just have memory, and then have 5 or 6 options about which memories. I think the M1 to M4 that are stored on the card is useful, but why not just store them all in the camera? Okay, so and if we're making up space on that shoot mode dial, because we're keeping like 4 or 5 memories just in one position on the memory dial, basically M and then subcategories, is I would perhaps like to see a night or low ambient shoot mode on the shoot mode dial. Again, it's one of the things that I have to explain to people. If you're out shooting at night at f8, the EVF or monitor is going to be pretty noisy, so have you considered switching or going to live view display and switching the setting effect off? Okay, I know it's there in the menus, but it's not in the function menu by default. And if there was a low ambient mode that could be used for maybe studio shooters as well, this would certainly save a lot of confusion out there, because a lot of people coming over from DSLRs are just not aware that the fact that these mirrorless cameras are shooting through their closed down aperture, and when there's very little light and you close down to f11 at night, there's a good reason that your EVF is noisy, is because you're having to gain up with very little light that's actually entering to that sensor. Okay, so those are some ideas for firmware. I think I'm just going to make sure I haven't missed anything out. Okay. Oh yeah, one we're at on the memories, 1, 2, 3. I would like that to be linked to the custom buttons, so that when you dialed in, say, 1 for portraits, your custom buttons were all set up for shooting portraits. But then when you move to maybe 2 for action, some of the custom buttons might change what they do, and they're more suited now to shooting action. I would love that to happen, so that when I could share some of my camera settings, I can not only share basically the shutter speed, aperture, auto ISO, minimum shutter speed, but I could also share how I've set up my custom buttons without getting them to go and program them manually. And that would also include the register custom shoot settings recall. Those are my basic overrides for, say, landscape, portrait, action. And it would be good to have those linked in as well, so that when I move from 1 to 2, my register custom shoot settings moves from 1 to 2 and then follows that memory along. Okay, so I think I've covered everything on my wish list. But one more item. And it's to do with flash. So many Sony users don't invest in the Sony systems just because they're a little bit expensive. You never see anyone on the forums complaining about the performance of the Sony flash like you do with some of the other brands. Probably not Godox, but some of the other brands, you know, talking about communication issues, about the flash doesn't go into high-speed sync or whatever. But I would perhaps like Sony just to reconsider lowering the price of maybe the receivers. The Commander, I think, is, you know, it's a reasonable price, maybe a little bit steep, but they could certainly lower the price of the receivers. So if people do have some older Sony flashes, they can start using those off camera. And I think we just need to come down a little bit on all of the flashes, so they were perhaps no more expensive than, say, Canon or Nikon flashes. Okay, so that's my wish list for 2019. I suspect that you've got 1 or 2 more. And so if you'd like to drop them down into the comments, I'm more than happy to share those with Sony. I am flying over to Japan in March, and if they haven't resolved some of these issues, I'm hoping to meet with some of the firmware engineers and then talk them through some of my ideas, basically give some community feedback to Sony, so we can make these alpha systems absolutely the best system in the world. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador. Just remember to subscribe. There is a donation button on my channel, my website. You'll see that I'm making basically hundreds of movies to support alpha users, get the best out of their cameras, so any small donation will make my job a lot easier. Okay, thanks very much, and see you soon online.